As an alternative to the previous tutorial, I want to show you briefly how to work with this wall, as well as show you some additional techniques that you may want to use. The first thing that you would need to do if you were using this wall is to remove this parking sign, because this would probably be in the middle of where you would want your mural to go. In order to do this pretty easily, you need to use what's called the clone stamp tool. The way the clone stamp tool works is that you can select from a different area of the image and then start painting that area wherever your scroller is. So let me show you how that works. If I were to select Option and holding down the Option key, I click right here, and then I move my cursor over here to the parking sign and I start painting, you'll notice that plus sign popping up. That plus sign is showing me exactly where my paintbrush is drawing from. And I can sample different areas of the wall to basically mimic its effect. Now this image is particularly good for this because it is so dynamic of a surface. So you wouldn't really notice much of a difference in the wall. If you opened the image, you probably wouldn't be able to spot where the parking sign was. Now, this little area right here, there's a little bit of red brick showing out from under this concrete overlay, and that's also a little distracting. So I'm going to continue to use the stamp tool and just cover that up a bit. Now you want to avoid shapes that are clearly recognizable, like that little hook shape there, which is copying this. I would want to cover that up so that you wouldn't see the repetition. A good way to approach this is to have a smaller brush and to make sure that you're not on full hardness. Something around 25, which is where I am, will make sure that your edges are soft enough that it'll basically blend into its surroundings. And just like that, you can go about cleaning up these little areas. I would also suggest that, as a rule of practice, to pull from an area that is farther away from wherever you're trying to draw so that the brain won't immediately connect those two shapes back together. The crack you can leave, that won't really be important. And now our space is pretty much ready to continue on. Now you'll notice that the perspective at which this photo was taken was at my eye level, and I'm a little short, so the perspective is not basically full on, directly looking at it. This wall has a slight diagonal to it, and this shadow has a diagonal, and basically the entire perspective of this composition doesn't feel like we are directly looking at it from a center vantage point. In order to change that, you need to go Edit, Transform, and then mess with the perspective or the distort. I'm going to use distort and just pull on this corner until I see that yellow wall basically parallel to the side of the image. And then I'm going to pull this corner and I'm going to look at that line of bricks up top and try to make a line parallel to the top of the composition. That looks about right. I can also open my crop tool, make sure that my plane is straight. And that's changing the bricks at the top a little bit. You'll notice that that's not exactly the same. So I can go back into my distort, pull on that a little bit. And that looks about right. Another thing that I would want to do at the outset is to add an adjustment layer for levels. This picture is kind of dark, and you're going to want to brighten it up. There we go. Okay, now you may be familiar with a muralist, a famous muralist called Banksy, who works primarily in England. If you wanted to make an image in Photoshop that looked kind of like Banksy, this is what you would want to do. I opened this picture of myself with Scout, and first things first, I'm going to convert the image to grayscale. It'll ask if I really want to discard the color information. I do, so I'll hit discard. And now you can go into Image, Adjustments, and you want to hit Threshold. Banksy's style is known for being one color, black, stencil-like imagery. So you would basically adjust this threshold until you had enough detail that you could see everything without too many of those blacks flattening out. Another way that you can do this is to go to Image Adjustments, Posterize. This one uses gray tones, so depending on what your image is, one may work better than the other. For me, I think Threshold is going to work much better. So I'm going to keep it about right there. That'll suit my purposes. I'm now going to copy all of this information and I'm going to paste it into my document. It will automatically put it onto a new layer. And I'm just going to scale that up to be bigger so that it'll fit into this mural space. That's pretty good. Now, one thing that I want to do is delete all of the white information in that layer. So I'm going to delete the eyeballs over here in the layers panel, make sure that this layer is selected, and now I'm going to go into select color range, click on the white, hit OK, and just hit the delete button, and you should see this checkerboard appear behind everything. Now I'm going to bring my other information back, and I'm going to change the blending mode on this layer to be something where I can see a little bit more of that texture beneath. I'll go ahead and just use overlay for now. Now, this is one way to make a Banksy-like image. You have this shadow area over here where these pipes are casting a shadow though, so let's say you want to get rid of that. You could do this in a non-lossy way by adding a vector mask. Then using your paintbrush, just a normal round paintbrush. And going in here and selecting that out. Now, this texture, sort of almost camouflage type shapes, I think I could actually render those a little bit better using my selection tool. So I'm actually going to grab that and do that again. Now once I have everything selected, go back in with my paintbrush and take care of that. There's a little bit more because I don't want to have that hard edge. I just don't like that as much compositionally. There are many different paintbrushes in Photoshop, and the different combinations and settings for these paintbrushes are nearly endless. So you're encouraged to watch a tutorial on paintbrushes specifically. I'm just going to briefly show you what they can do. Let's say that I go ahead and create a new layer, and I want to change the type of paintbrush that I'm using. There are some right here in the general brushes. I can also go over here to brush settings and see little icons of what the brush type would look like. So let's say I wanted to play with this one, number 127. You can change the spacing of this brush, and you can also change the size and sometimes the hardness as well. I actually want to play with this splatter right here. And I want it to be a really, really big splatter. And I'm going to use a bright teal, not quite that big. The easiest way to change the size of your brush, by the way, is to hit the left and right brackets. The left bracket will shrink your brush, the right bracket will increase it. So I'm just going to add a pop of color right there. Then change my splatter. Get a bigger brush, another pop of color right there. And then maybe I'll go in something like this. Another color. Go like that. And if you click on the same space again and again and again, it will increase the opacity usually. You can also change the flow up here, the opacity up here, and this particular setting called smoothing has to do with how smooth it'll make the transition of your brush. So if you were trying to draw, let's say with a regular round brush at a pretty small size, there's an arc that I made without any smoothing at all. If I turn my smoothing up to 100% and I try to make the same arc, you'll notice how much smoother that one is. So keep that in mind as you're trying to make complex or organic shapes. I'm going to undo those real quick. And of course, these being in different colors, I could make them on different layers if I wanted. And if I want them to be situated behind the image, or more so, I can just set it to the back. Now, this particular blending mode is an overlay, so it's kind of interacting with all the other layers. So this one being normal is going to be a little stronger, but I can always change the blending mode of that as well. So beyond tutorials, I would also recommend that you just play around with the brush tool as much as possible. You can play with your size, you can play with your hardness, and you can even play, as I said, with the spacing. All of those different combinations will mean that a single brush can act in many different ways. And you can have a whole lot of fun with it. Now, one other thing that I'd like to say about blending modes with layers. This particular layer with my key image isn't really a full black. If I wanted to beef it up a little bit more and I can't increase the opacity, you can always duplicate that layer and it will be automatically in the same blending mode, but you now have the ability to change the opacity and make it a little bit darker, because I really like the overlay technique for this particular situation, but I didn't like how light it was. So this lets me get it a little bit darker, a little bit richer, and it helps it pop a lot more. So that's another option for different things that you can do in Photoshop. You would still need to go through and label all of your layers correctly, and if you wanted to add graphic elements, you would do so with the appropriate types of layers, either shaped layers or smart object layers, etc. No texture type layers as it says in the project parameters, but I wanted to give you guys a little more information about the brushes that you have, about your clone stamp tool, and what to do in situations where your layer isn't quite as dark as it needs to be, but you want to keep it on a certain blending mode. Okay?